There's a common misconception that certain people instantly unmask, others through intuition alone. In reality, what looks like intuition is usually pattern recognition built from sensitivity to inconsistency, micro-behavioral change, emotional incongruence, and conversational structure. When people talk about empaths, what they are often describing is a nervous system that is highly responsive to subtle shifts in tone, pacing, affect, and relational energy. That sensitivity can be useful, but it is not supernatural accuracy, and it is not immunity from deception. It is simply faster detection of anomalies when properly trained and emotionally regulated. Covert narcissistic patterns are not identified through a single giveaway behavior. The danger in oversimplification is that it leads to false positives, where emotionally expressive, socially awkward, or trauma-impacted individuals get misread as manipulative. The actual signal lies in repetition of behavioral clusters over time, especially under mild pressure, boundary conditions, or moments where the individual cannot maintain a controlled presentation. One of the earliest detectable patterns is inconsistent identity stabilization. In conversation, most regulated individuals maintain a relatively stable narrative of who they are, what they value, and how they interpret events. In contrast, manipulative personalities often adjust their self-description based on the perceived expectations of the listener. This is not always conscious deception. It is sometimes a reflexive adaptation strategy, designed to secure approval, admiration, or emotional supply. The key indicator is not change itself, but lack of internal continuity across contexts. If a person describes themselves as highly independent in one setting, deeply misunderstood in another, exceptionally skilled in a third, and victimized in a fourth, without coherent linkage, the observer should track whether these identities are situationally convenient rather than structurally integrated. Another layer is emotional mirroring without emotional depth. Some individuals replicate emotional language extremely well. They can say the right words, display appropriate facial expressions, and even time their responses correctly. However, when observed closely, there is often a gap between expressed emotion and physiological congruence. The emotional display appears placed rather than generated. It has timing, but not depth. It has form, but not continuity. Over time, this creates a subtle sense of dissonance in the observer, often described as something feeling off without immediate evidence. A key behavioral marker emerges in conversational control dynamics. In healthy interaction, control is fluid and shared. In manipulative structures, control is subtly centralized. This is done not through overt domination, but through topic steering, emotional reframing, and selective validation. For example, when accountability is introduced into conversation, there is often a redirection toward emotional ambiguity. Instead of addressing the specific behavior, the narrative shifts toward intent, misunderstanding, or the emotional impact on the accused. This creates cognitive fog in the conversation partner, shifting them from clarity-based thinking into affect-based reasoning. Another recurring mechanism is strategic vulnerability display. Genuine vulnerability is often inconsistent, messy, and not optimized for effect. It appears in moments of breakdown, fatigue, or trust, and it is not designed to produce a specific response. Strategic vulnerability, however, appears structured. It is delivered at moments where it maximizes sympathy, reduces scrutiny, or resets relational tension. It often functions as a reset button in accountability cycles. The observer may notice a repeating sequence. Boundary is set, resistance occurs, emotional narrative is introduced, boundary is softened, normal interaction resumes. This cycle is one of the most important structural patterns to recognize, because it indicates regulation of relational consequences through emotional interference rather than resolution. There is also the phenomenon of identity inflation under low verification conditions. When external validation is available without challenge, some individuals expand their self-description. They may claim higher competence, deeper insight, or stronger relational impact than can be consistently verified. The key diagnostic point is not ambition or confidence, but resistance to calibration. When gently questioned, or when reality introduces friction, the response is often discomfort, deflection, or subtle devaluation of the questioning party. Devaluation cycles themselves are critical. In early phases of interaction, there may be idealization characterized by high attentiveness, rapid bonding language, and elevated perception of uniqueness. Over time, as relational expectations stabilize, subtle shifts appear. These include reduction in attentiveness, increased irony or sarcasm, selective forgetting of agreements, and micro-invalidations of the other person's perceptions. These shifts are rarely abrupt. They are incremental enough that the recipient often doubts their own perception, especially if they are high in empathy or conflict avoidance. One of the strongest internal indicators observers report is cognitive dissonance, accumulation. This occurs when words and behaviors repeatedly fail to align, but each individual instance is too small to justify confrontation. Instead of a single obvious contradiction, there is a pattern of micro-inconsistencies that build psychological fatigue. The observer begins to overanalyze neutral behavior, not because they are paranoid, but because predictive accuracy in the relationship is low. Human cognition is designed to seek pattern stability, and when stability fails, hypervigilance increases. Another structural feature is externalization of responsibility under pressure. When outcomes are negative, there is a consistent drift toward external explanations. Context is emphasized over choice, emotion is emphasized over action, and intent is emphasized over impact. This creates a moral fog where accountability becomes difficult to anchor. Importantly, this is not always verbal blame. It can be narrative restructuring that subtly removes the self from causal responsibility, while maintaining emotional presence in the situation. A less obvious but highly reliable indicator is differential treatment across audiences. Individuals with manipulative tendencies often present significantly different relational versions, depending on social hierarchy. To authority figures, they may appear compliant and impressive. To peers, charismatic and engaging. To those they perceive as emotionally invested, controlling or dismissive patterns may emerge. The key is not variability itself, but strategic optimization of persona based on perceived utility. When analyzing interaction patterns over time, one of the most important frameworks is to observe recovery after confrontation. Healthy individuals, when confronted with behavioral impact, may experience discomfort but tend toward integration and adjustment. Manipulative patterns often show a different trajectory: initial resistance, followed by emotional reframing, then partial concession without behavioral change, and eventual repetition of the same cycle under similar conditions. This creates the illusion of growth without structural change. There is also a consistent pattern in how boundaries are treated. Boundaries are not always openly violated. In many cases, they are tested through ambiguity. The observer may notice delayed responses, partial compliance, reinterpretation of what was agreed upon, or emotional consequences applied when boundaries are enforced. The key signal is not the boundary crossing itself, but the reaction to the existence of the boundary. High empathy individuals often misinterpret intensity as authenticity. Emotional expressiveness, especially when combined with storytelling ability, can create a false signal of depth. However, emotional intensity is not equivalent to emotional consistency. Some individuals can generate high-intensity emotional output without stable internal regulation. This is where misinterpretation occurs. The nervous system responds to intensity as if it indicates truth, when in fact it may simply indicate skillful expression. Another important behavioral layer is conversational debt creation. This occurs when emotional or informational exchanges are structured in a way that creates implied obligation. The individual may share personal information, offer assistance, or provide emotional framing that subtly establishes a return expectation. When the return is not provided, even if not explicitly requested, relational tension is introduced. Over time, this creates a system where the other person feels perpetually behind in emotional reciprocity without clear evidence of wrongdoing. One of the most advanced patterns involves controlled ambiguity. Statements are structured to be interpretable in multiple ways depending on the listener's emotional state. This allows later denial or reinterpretation without appearing dishonest. The language remains technically flexible while emotionally suggestive. When challenged, the speaker can retreat into the literal interpretation, while the listener remembers the implied meaning. This mismatch becomes a source of confusion and self-doubt in the receiver. As these patterns accumulate, the most significant effect is not any single behavior, but the gradual erosion of interpretive confidence in the observer. They begin to second-guess perception, reinterpret obvious signals as overreactions, and rely more heavily on the other person's framing of reality. This shift is subtle but central. It is the point where relational asymmetry becomes established. Detection, therefore, is less about identifying a label and more about tracking consistency, reciprocity, accountability integration, and emotional congruence across time. When these variables repeatedly fail to align, the observer is not dealing with a single behavioral quirk, but with a systemic relational pattern that prioritizes self-stability over mutual clarity. The most reliable internal checkpoint is not emotional intensity, suspicion, or labeling language. It is whether interactions increase or decrease cognitive clarity over time. Healthy dynamics tend to reduce confusion, increase predictability, and allow both parties to refine understanding. Unhealthy manipulative dynamics tend to increase interpretive load, emotional uncertainty, and retrospective reinterpretation of past interactions. When clarity consistently decreases despite increased familiarity, the system is not becoming more transparent with time. It is becoming more adaptive in its ambiguity. At this stage of relational analysis, the most important shift is understanding that perception is being shaped not only by what is said, but by what is consistently left unresolved. Manipulative relational systems do not rely on overt contradiction as much as they rely on suspended resolution. Meaning is introduced, tension is created, but closure is delayed, redirected, or partially delivered in ways that keep the other person cognitively engaged. Over time, this creates a looping mental environment, where the observer is always almost understanding, but never fully able to stabilize interpretation. One of the most underestimated mechanisms in these dynamics is temporal distortion, info accountability. When behavior is addressed, there is often a delay tactic introduced that reframes immediacy as overreaction. The issue is not denied outright, but its urgency is softened. This creates a subtle displacement where emotional clarity that should be anchored in the closed, where emblems or becoming an present moment, is pushed into a vague future resolution space. The observer begins to accept postponement as part of the relational rhythm, which weakens the natural instinct for immediate boundary enforcement. Another structural layer involves selective memory engagement. In consistent relational systems, memory is relatively symmetrical. Both individuals reference shared events with similar emotional and factual framing. In manipulative structures, memory becomes asymmetric. Certain events are vividly remembered when useful for emotional positioning, and conveniently blurred or reinterpreted when accountability is required. This is not always deliberate lying. It often manifests as adaptive recall, where memory retrieval is guided by emotional self-protection rather than factual consistency. The impact on the observer is destabilization of shared reality, because the reference points of what actually happened begin to shift depending on context. A key behavioral signal emerges in repair attempts after conflict. In healthy dynamics, repair is characterized by specificity, acknowledgement of impact, and behavioral adjustment. In contrast, in unstable manipulative patterns, repair often takes the form of emotional substitution. Instead of addressing the precise behavior that caused rupture, the interaction is redirected toward emotional reconnection. Affection, apology, or intensity is used as a substitute for structural change. This creates the illusion of resolution without altering the underlying behavioral loop. There is also a recurring pattern of indirect dominance assertion. Rather than explicit control, influence is exerted through emotional consequences tied to compliance. If agreement is given, emotional warmth is maintained. If resistance is introduced, emotional withdrawal, subtle hostility, or confusion is introduced. This creates a learning environment where the observer begins to unconsciously optimize to behavior to maintain emotional stability in the relationship. Over time, this shifts decision-making away from internal values and toward external, emotional regulation. Another critical mechanism is reputational positioning. In many cases, individuals with manipulative traits are highly aware of how they are perceived socially and will actively manage their external image. This creates a dual-layer system, an external persona that is coherent, likable, and socially functional, and a private relational pattern that is inconsistent or controlling. The gap between these two layers is what makes detection difficult. Observers often doubt their own experience because the external validation of others contradicts their internal relational reality. A further refinement in these patterns is emotional timing control. Emotional expression is not random. It is often deployed at moments of maximum psychological leverage. For example, emotional distress may emerge precisely when accountability is being introduced, or affection may intensify when distance is increasing. This timing creates associative conditioning in the observer's nervous system, linking boundary enforcement with emotional discomfort and compliance with emotional relief. Over time, this conditioning reduces resistance without requiring overt coercion. One of the more subtle but highly consistent features is conversational asymmetry in depth. The manipulative individual may appear highly open, sharing personal narratives and emotional history. However, deeper examination often reveals that this disclosure remains at a controlled depth. It is expressive enough to create intimacy, but structured enough to avoid true vulnerability that would expose long-term accountability or internal contradiction. Meanwhile, the other person is often drawn into deeper self-disclosure, creating an imbalance in emotional exposure. This imbalance leads to what can be described as interpretive authority drift. The individual who controls narrative framing begins to subtly define what experiences mean. Instead of two people independently interpreting events, one person's interpretation becomes the default reference point. This is rarely enforced explicitly. It happens through repetition, confidence in delivery, and subtle correction of alternative interpretations. Over time, the observer begins to defer to the other person's framing, even when internal intuition signals inconsistency. Another advanced pattern is partial truth structuring. Statements are constructed using elements that are factually accurate but arranged in a way that produces a misleading overall impression. This creates a defensive advantage because any challenge can be met with technical correctness while ignoring contextual distortion. The observer is placed in a position where proving inconsistency becomes difficult, even though the emotional reality of the interaction feels misaligned. As relational cycles continue, a phenomenon of emotional anchoring fatigue emerges. This is where the observer becomes increasingly reliant on intermittent, positive reinforcement to maintain engagement in the relationship. Moments of warmth, clarity, or connection become disproportionately impactful compared to periods of confusion or instability. This imbalance strengthens attachment even when overall relational quality is low, because the nervous system begins to prioritize relief over consistency. Another important dimension is boundary reinterpretation. Instead of directly violating boundaries, the structure often involves redefining them. What was previously understood as a clear limit becomes gradually reframed as flexible, negotiable, or context-dependent. This creates a slow erosion of relational structure without obvious rupture. The observer may notice that what once felt unacceptable now feels only mildly uncomfortable, not because the behavior improved, but because internal standards have been gradually adjusted. There is also a recurring pattern of emotional triangulation, where external references are introduced into the relational dynamic to influence perception. This can include comparisons to other relationships, referencing third-party opinions, or invoking hypothetical scenarios where the observer appears unreasonable. The function of this mechanism is to destabilize internal certainty by introducing external validation pressure. In longer interactions, a shift often occurs where the observer begins to preemptively self-regulate to avoid conflict. This is a critical transformation point. Instead of reacting to behavior, they begin adjusting themselves in anticipation of emotional outcomes. This anticipatory adaptation is often mistaken for maturity or relational skill, but, in manipulative dynamics, it is frequently a sign of conditioning through inconsistent reinforcement. A key analytical marker is the ratio between clarity-producing interactions and confusion-producing interactions. Healthy systems produce increasing clarity over time, even through conflict. Unstable systems produce repeated cycles where clarity is temporarily achieved but then undermined by subsequent reinterpretation, contradiction, or emotional reframing. The cumulative effect is not static confusion, but expanding confusion with increased relational investment. Another layer involves identity pressure projection. Over time, the observer may begin to feel subtly pushed into a role that stabilizes the other person's emotional or narrative needs. This role may be caretaker, validator, emotional regulator, or stabilizing witness. Once this role is established, deviation from it is often met with discomfort in the system, even if not explicitly expressed. The relationship becomes structured around maintaining this psychological equilibrium, rather than mutual authenticity. In high-empathy individuals, this dynamic is intensified by the natural tendency to scan for emotional distress and respond to it. This creates a feedback loop where emotional turbulence in the other person triggers increased effort, explanation, or accommodation from the observer. If the other person unconsciously or strategically generates turbulence, they gain relational leverage without direct confrontation. Over time, The most significant transformation is not behavioral but perceptual. The observer's internal calibration system begins to shift. What once triggered immediate recognition of inconsistency now produces hesitation. What once felt clearly misaligned now requires analysis. This delay in interpretation is one of the most important indicators that relational line influence has moved from surface interaction into deeper cognitive framing. Eventually, the core question is no longer about identifying isolated behaviors, but about assessing systemic effect. Does interaction with this person produce increased mental clarity, emotional stability, and behavioral coherence, or does it produce fragmentation, reinterpretation, and internal negotiation of reality? The answer to this question determines whether the dynamic is reciprocal or extractive in rupture. At the deepest level, what appears as unmasking is not a single moment of revelation, but the deep point at which accumulated inconsistencies exceed the observer's capacity for rationalization. The system does not collapse because of one event. It collapses because the cost of maintaining coherence becomes higher than the cost of acknowledging incoherence. At the next layer of this framework, the focus shifts from behavioral observation to internal cognitive load. Because by this stage, the most advanced part of the dynamic is no longer what the other person is. It is what the observer's mind is being trained to do in response. In stable relational environments, cognition is efficient. The mind receives input, applies relatively consistent interpretive rules, and produces a conclusion that remains durable over time. In destabilizing relational environments, cognition becomes recursive. Each new interaction forces a re-evaluation of prior interpretations. Past conclusions are not allowed to remain settled. They are reopened, reframed, and reprocessed in light of new emotional information that appears to contradict earlier certainty. This creates what can be described as interpretive recursion loops. The observer is no longer simply analyzing behavior. They are continuously reanalyzing their own analysis. This is a critical transformation point because it means the relational system is no longer operating only at a behavioral level. It has begun operating at a cognitive architecture level. One of the most reliable markers of this shift is the presence of delayed certainty. The observer notices that understanding no longer arrives in real time. Instead, clarity only appears after distance, reflection, or emotional disengagement. During direct interaction, perception is clouded. After interaction, coherence returns. This split between in-the-moment confusion and post-exposure clarity is one of the strongest indicators that emotional interference is active within the relational field. Another deep mechanism involves emotional substitution of logic. When inconsistency arises, instead of resolving it through factual alignment, the system offers emotional alternatives: affection, regret, intensity, urgency, vulnerability. These emotional signals function as cognitive interrupts. They do not answer the inconsistency. They bypass it. Over time, the observer begins to unconsciously prioritize emotional resolution over logical resolution because emotional resolution provides immediate relief from cognitive tension. This leads to what can be called resolution addiction loops. The mind begins to prefer closure signals over accuracy. A comforting explanation becomes more neurologically rewarding than an accurate but uncomfortable one. In this environment, truth is not rejected directly. It is gradually deprioritized in favor of emotional stability. At a structural level, manipulative relational systems often rely on asymmetrical accountability frameworks. This means that one party is held to behavioral consistency standards, while the other operates under contextual flexibility. When the observer deviates, the deviation is categorized as meaningful. When the other party deviates, it is contextualized, excused, or emotionally reframed. This imbalance does not need to be explicitly stated. It is enforced through repeated interaction outcomes. Over time, this creates a silent hierarchy of interpretive legitimacy. One person becomes the default authority on what is reasonable, what is emotional, and what is realistic. The other begins to calibrate their self-perception through that authority. This is not conscious submission. It is cognitive adaptation to repeated feedback patterns. A further refinement appears in the form of contradiction compartmentalization. In consistent systems, contradictions are addressed directly and resolved. In unstable systems, contradictions are isolated into separate emotional contexts so they do not collide. For example, a person can be caring in one moment and dismissive in another, but each behavior is stored in a separate interpretive box that prevents full synthesis. The observer experiences discomfort, but cannot easily integrate it into a single coherent narrative, which delays decisive recognition. Another advanced indicator is affective time lag. Emotional responses from the manipulative individual often appear slightly delayed or plain strategically timed relative to the interaction context. This creates a sense that emotional states are being applied rather than organically experienced in real time. The observer may not consciously identify this, but the nervous system registers the inconsistency between stimulus and emotional response timing. There is also a recurring pattern of narrative elasticity under stress. When pressure is low, communication appears coherent and structured. When pressure increases, through accountability, boundary setting, or contradiction, the narrative becomes more flexible, shifting to accommodate the threat without collapsing entirely. The key observation is that structure is not maintained under stress. It is reshaped. In psychologically stable individuals, stress may reduce articulation, but does not fundamentally alter core consistency. In unstable patterns, stress actively reorganizes narrative structure. At a more subtle level, the observer often begins to experience identity diffusion within the relationship context. This occurs when their internal sense of what is true becomes increasingly dependent on external validation from the relational partner. The observer may find themselves thinking in terms of how their perceptions will be received, rather than whether those perceptions are accurate. This marks a shift from internal reference to external calibration. Another critical mechanism is emotional reversal framing. In certain interactions, the person enforcing boundaries is subtly repositioned as the source of relational tension. This is not done through direct accusation, but through emotional reframing of roles. The observer may be told, implicitly or explicitly, that their clarity is harsh, their boundaries are distancing, or their need for consistency is emotionally demanding. This reframing creates guilt responses around normal psychological needs for coherence. As these mechanisms accumulate, the observer begins to experience what can be described as reality friction fatigue. This is the exhaustion that results from continuously trying to align internal perception with external feedback that does not match. The mind attempts to reconcile inconsistencies by increasing cognitive effort rather than rejecting the system. This is a natural human tendency. Coherence-seeking behavior is deeply ingrained in cognition. Eventually, however, a threshold is reached where additional cognitive effort no longer produces increased clarity. At this point, the system enters breakdown recognition mode. This is not emotional collapse, it is interpretive saturation. The observer can no longer generate a coherent model that explains both the emotional experience and the behavioral data simultaneously. When this threshold is crossed, perception shifts from analysis of individual behaviors to recognition of structural pattern failure. The question is no longer, what does this behavior mean? But why do I need to reinterpret basic interactions repeatedly in order for them to make sense? This is the point at which unmasking occurs in practical terms. Not as a dramatic revelation, but as a cognitive decision to stop forcing coherence onto a system that repeatedly produces incoherence. The clarity is not newly discovered. It is finally permitted to remain stable without being overwritten by the next interaction cycle. From here, the most important realization is that perception was never the primary battlefield. The primary battleground was interpretive stability. Whoever controls consistency of meaning over time controls relational reality more effectively than whoever controls individual moments of emotion or persuasion. And at this stage, the observer's system begins to reassert its own baseline, reducing recursive analysis, restoring internal reference points, and re-establishing the difference between emotional intensity and structural truth.